Hey wizards, Treantmonk here, and today's video we are going to be talking about the various roles in the party and how the wizard can fill those roles or help to fill those roles. Now I did a video back in February where I talked about roles within the party. I'll throw a link up there. So if you want to check that out first so you know what I'm talking about, please do. But if you've seen it before, or you kind of know what the roles in the party are already, then it is not necessary viewing. So what roles can a wizard fill in a party? Well, pretty much they can fill almost all of them. And some of them they do very well, some of them they struggle a little bit. But for the most part, a wizard can fill just about any role in the party. And we're going to discuss how you can do that in today's video. So, welcome to Treantmonk's Guide to Wizards.
I quote, "You know your damn role and shut your damn mouth."
Okay, so when we're talking about roles within the party, we really have to talk about combat roles and non-combat roles. Because the game will have periods of combat, periods of non-combat, and you're going to want to contribute in both cases. So we'll talk about the non-combat roles first. And the first role we'll talk about is the party leader, also known as the party face sometimes. This is the person who tends to do the talking when you interact with NPCs, and they often end up being a leader role within the party itself, kind of being the tiebreaker on decisions that you might be split on in the party, or the decisive one. Now, wizards are generally not going to have a very high charisma score, and often charisma is associated with a lot of the skills you're going to be using as a party leader, like persuasion or deception or intimidation. And because we don't have that great charisma, wizard isn't necessarily the optimal choice here. But there is some reason why you might consider having the wizard as the party leader. First, from just purely a role-playing perspective, the wizard is going to be the most intelligent person in the party. Does it make sense for the most intelligent person in the party to be making some of the decisions? I think so. Now, I've had a chance to experience this. In a recent campaign, I played an illusionist who ended up becoming the party leader. And this was kind of an out-of-character decision and an in-character decision. And the way I role-played that is I kind of got into the idea that this character was very, very smart. So he analyzed each party member, what they could do, what items they had, and then he became kind of the tactician for the party. When magic items would show up, he would know which character could best make use of it, and in combats then there were defined roles for the party that he had come up with and tactics for them to use. In other words, the combat dynamics became more formalized than they normally are, and that actually worked reasonably well. The issue is that when you make those social skill roles, you're not going to have that high charisma to fall back on. Now, you can still be proficient in those skills, so that doesn't mean you're going to be bad at them. But you're not going to be as good as somebody else might be. So if I'm making a wizard that is going to be filling the party face leader role, the first thing I would probably do is I would think about that when I'm choosing my backgrounds. And I would probably choose a background like noble. I think that's a good choice for that role because it gives you appropriate skills. The background ability is pretty appropriate for that kind of character. I think there's some just straight out role-playing advantages to being a noble, though something like an entertainer might be an idea as well. Now, when we're choosing spells, there are spells we can choose that will help us in this role. The first thing is with the cantrips, I'd probably be looking at the Friends cantrip. There's the obvious downside of Friends is that after it expires, the person knows they've been charmed and it makes them hostile to you. But for a short duration, quick interaction, it can give you that advantage. And even if you don't have a high charisma, advantage is going to give a big bonus on that roll. With second level spells, there's a couple spells as well that I think can really help you out. The first is Enhance Ability, again, giving you that advantage on charisma checks. And with Enhance Ability, of course, then you're not worrying about them becoming hostile after the spell ends. Suggestion is also a very good choice here, because then we can interact with people without having to make a charisma roll. Instead, they are going to have to make a saving throw against our spell DC based on our intelligence. So we're taking our intelligence stat and making that the primary stat we're using in those social situations. Now, if you're a diviner, you might also find something like Portent could be useful there. Portent tends to be useful everywhere. And another way it can be done is if you're not in a combat situation, you still roll your Portent and you're still going to apply it, but you'll apply it to things like ability checks. as you might when you're doing a social role. Often though, if you get into the role playing, this often is a style of role playing kind of thing. If you are somebody who is introverted and at the table you like to play a little more introverted, you don't want to be the main one talking, then this isn't the role for you. Don't take it. It doesn't matter whether your character is high charisma or low charisma, what spells you have, because this is largely going to be a role-playing thing. This is going to be somebody who needs to be able to role-play interaction with NPCs. If you're not comfortable with that, then don't do it. Do what is fun for you at the table. But if it is fun for you, there's no reason you can't do it as a wizard, because often you don't even have to make social roles. If you speak in a way that's very reasonable, you make reasonable suggestions, you talk diplomatically, your DM may not require a roll at all, or they might give you advantage on that roll based on the fact that you're being reasonable. The next out of combat role is the scout. So this one is usually in a case where you are in a position where combat might happen. And the scout is the one who is going to be checking out ahead for enemies to see if you can maybe get an ambush, maybe get surprise. They're going to be the ones who are looking for the traps and disabling them or finding a way around them. They're going to be the ones who, when you come against a locked door or locked chest, they'll probably be the ones who will be unlocking it. Scouts will tend to be stealthy or inconspicuous. So how can a wizard fill this role? Well, the most obvious thing is right away at first level, you're going to take Find Familiar. And the Find Familiar is actually going to end up filling a lot of the criteria of the scout. You may not even need a scout in your party just from the familiar alone, because that familiar is able to go ahead and check for enemies. That familiar, if you choose the right form, can very well be inconspicuous. You might choose a rat in a sewer or an owl if you're out in a forest at night. You can just choose a form for your familiar that's going to be appropriate for where you are, and if an enemy sees it, there's no reason for them to think that it's anything other than a hawk. Now, if you really want to fill this role, you need to do a little more than just have a Find Familiar spell. So what I would probably be looking at is either the criminal or the urchin backgrounds. That's going to give you your Thieves' Tool proficiency. You're probably going to have good dex. Wizards will tend to have a good dexterity, so there's no reason why they can't be just as good at that as a rogue would be. And then we can additionally help ourselves out with some spell casting. So we can cast invisibility on ourselves. Or, and I really like this one, you can use things like summoned creatures or undead thralls to do the dangerous stuff for you. So instead of discovering traps, you set them off. So you suspect there might be a trap down in this room, so you're going to send an undead zombie in while you are back, and then the terrible things happen to the zombie. Whoops, zombie's dead. I guess there was a trap there. Now you know what that trap was, and if it's still active, now you can determine how to circumnavigate it. The next out of combat role is the muscle man or the strong man. They're the ones who are like lifting the gates or bashing down the doors. It's one of those ones that we tend not to think about until we need it, and then we need it and nobody has a good strength. It's quite easy to have an entire party in D&D where nobody has a good strength, especially now that we have things like Hexblade that allow you to bypass the necessity of having good strength even on a melee character using a sword. So the muscle strongman is often something completely ignored. Now there's a couple ways the wizard can fill this role. The first is you can make a wizard with a high strength. When we get into talking about races and builds, we'll look at some ways where we might actually want to have a wizard with a good strength. There's certain builds where that makes sense. For the most part, though, your wizards are going to have a bad strength. It's usually going to be your worst stat. So you would think that would make it so that you're not very good in this role. And we're certainly not the best for that role. Now, we can definitely help out somebody else fill that role. We can take something like the Enlarge Reduce spell. We give them Enlarge, that gives them advantage on their strength checks. Again, Enhance Ability can be a help as well. But if we are filling this role, and let's say we don't have a good strength, there are some things we can do. Number one, summoning is your friend here. We might not have a good strength, but we can summon creatures that do have a good strength. I mean, a zombie has a strength of 13. That's not great, but it's not bad. But once we get into things like Conjure Elemental, then we can do an Earth Elemental. That's got a 20 strength. Never mind the fact that it does double damage to things like objects and structures. Of course, you can't conjure elementals until you're a fairly high level, but there are things we can do at lower levels as well. The Tensor's Floating Disc spell is a ritual spell, which means we don't need to prepare it. All we need is to have it in our spellbook and we can cast it. It can carry 500 pounds for us. So if you do need to carry something over a distance that is very heavy, and that's the reason you need the Strongman, Tensor's floating disc is a workaround for that. If you're in a situation where you're hoping to push or shove somebody out of the way, the Gust cantrip can be very handy there. You can push medium-sized creatures, and they need to make a saving throw, and that then is based off your intelligence rather than your strength. The Enlarge Reduce spell, of course, has more uses than just making somebody large. We can cast it on objects to make them small. So there's that gate you need to lift to get past it. Well, you just cast Reduce on it and pick it up and remove it. We can do the same thing on doors. This is kind of one of the main utility uses of the Enlarge Reduce spell, and it can work around a lot of things where you might have otherwise needed somebody with a high strength. And when we're talking about destroying objects, this is where a spell that I normally think is kind of so-so, like the Catapult spell, ends up being a little more useful because we can use it on those non-combat situations as well, just to do damage to objects, things like doors or gates or something we need to bust through. But again, we can make a wizard who can also be strong, and when we do that, then it is pretty easy for us to fill this role just the normal way. So that brings us to the Utility Caster. This is obviously our strength. You're going to have a tough time not filling the Utility Caster role. So what does the Utility Caster do? Well, he casts spells like Detect Magic, Identify, Water Breathing, Lehman's Tiny Hut, Phantom Steed, Alarm, Comprehend Languages. By the way, all these spells I've mentioned are all ritual spells, so we are by far the best choice for these spells because we don't have to prepare them and use up those precious preparation slots, and we can have a huge variety of utility spells at our beck and call. The only issue here is we normally only get 2 spells per level. So setting is going to be a factor. If you're crawling through a huge dungeon, you're not coming across a lot of spell books, it's going to be harder for you to select every ritual. You're going to have to kind of pick the ones you think are the most important. But if you're playing in, say, a city, there's a good chance that certainly low-level spells will be available for purchase, and then you can get, and most of these ritual spells are first level too. And there's a few really good third level ones, and then there's one good fifth level one. So no matter what other non-combat roles you're taking, you can also take this one. It's easy for you. That takes us to our final out-of-combat role, and that's the Knowledge Guy. And we are the obvious person to fill this role too, because most of the knowledge skills like history and arcana and even like religion and nature, these are all based on intelligence. So we can be better at religion than the cleric, we can be better at nature than the druid, based off our high intelligence along with a proficiency. Now we're not going to be proficient in all these skills, but we can certainly be proficient in a few of them. They're mostly going to be class skills for us, and then if we take an appropriate background like Sage, we can take a couple more. Also, it's usually common to have a number of languages with this role, but of course we have comprehend languages, so when it comes to things like reading foreign languages or listening to foreign languages, we can fill that pretty easy. Where it's a little bit harder is if we have to communicate 2 ways. Then we either need the tongue spell, which is significantly higher level and not a ritual, or know those languages. So again, a background where we're getting some languages is probably preferable to getting tool proficiencies. If we are going to consider multi-classing our wizard, and there's of course 2 sides to that coin, because anytime we multi-class, we're slowing down our spellcasting progression. And spellcasting is what we do. It's the most important thing we do. So slowing that down for any reason is pretty painful. But if you are considering multi-class, the one multi-class I think is strong is a single level dip into the Knowledge Cleric. The Knowledge Cleric is a good fit for a wizard because you're going to get 2 knowledge skills, you're going to have expertise in those knowledge skills. So 2 additional skills with expertise that is synergetic with our high intelligence. And we can take a few good spells that wouldn't have otherwise been available. Things like the Guidance spell is a really good choice for a wizard. I mean, generally you want to avoid the spells that are going to rely too much on your wisdom because you're probably going to be doing it with a 13 wisdom. So you're not going to be great at those. But things like the Bless spell and that kind of thing, you can do reasonably well and you don't need the good wisdom. Of course, you get the bonus of armor and shield as well, so it increases your defense. So there's a number of good things that brings to us at the cost of our spellcasting. It's a tough call, right? Because putting back our spellcasting, as I said, is very painful. Even if we're not losing spell slots, we're losing our access to those higher level spells as early as we normally would get them. That's not going to hurt every level, but it will certainly hurt all the odd levels. Of course, another way we can fulfill the knowledge guy role is through spells, and we're probably looking primarily at divination spells here. Now, we don't have to be a diviner to cast divination spells. Any wizard can still do this. But if you are a diviner, then you will get spell slots back when you cast divination spells. So there's a little bit of synergy there as well. So spells like tongues, scrying, detect thoughts, arcane eye, clairvoyance, scrying, these are all kind of standouts here, and they all end up being divination spells. So with most wizards, you would expect automatically you're going to be the knowledge guy, you're automatically going to be the utility caster. As far as being a scout, you're going to be able to do a little bit of that pretty much automatically as well with your Find Familiar. So without doing anything special, we're already filling a lot of these roles. But if you want to be the party leader, if you want to be the strong guy, if you want to be a complete scout, you can do that through a mix of your spell casting and some smart decisions and things like backgrounds. So let's move on to our combat roles. Obviously, the very first thing I'm going to talk about here is the God Wizard, because that is going to be the best role a wizard can fill. In my opinion, this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. The God Wizard is a support character. So support characters tend to provide four things, or a mix of these four things. They'll control the battlefield, they will debuff their enemies, buff their allies, and heal their allies. Now, you don't need to be able to do all four of these things, but I figure you should be able to do at least two of them. And this should be something that you can do pretty much in every combat. So this isn't a once in a while kind of thing. This is your role. So your job as the support character, as the God Wizard, isn't to win fights for the party. We're not going to go in there, be dramatic, take out all the enemies, and have the party just watch us do it. The role is support. So what we're going to be doing, what we're going to be focusing on, is giving the rest of the characters a tactical or mechanical advantage in a combat, because usually a combat is already kind of weighted towards the players. You're supposed to win the fights, generally speaking, unless there's a story appropriate reason to have you lose a fight. But in most cases, you're supposed to win the fight, but bad luck can be an issue. And the support character can remove that factor of bad luck by providing a greater mechanical advantage. And unlike something like a barbarian who just goes in and swings and swings and swings until either they go down or the enemy goes down, we can adjust the amount of resources we put into a combat as we go. When we notice that things are turning against the party or things ended up being harder than we thought, we can put a little more in. Or if we notice things are going well, we can pull back and save some of those resources for later. So there's a little more tactics, a little more thought to make this effective. So buffing allies is something that I tend not to do as much in 5th edition as I did in previous editions, because the buffs are not quite as dramatically good as they were in previous editions, but that's okay, because one thing buffing does is it ignores things like magic resistance. It doesn't care what the battlefield looks like or if the enemies have immunities. Buffing is done on our allies, so we don't have to worry about a saving throw. It's always going to work. So again, if we're bringing that small mechanical advantage with 100% reliability, it's still a good tactic. Now, we don't have a huge number of buffs available or a huge number of great buffs available, but there are a few ones that I think are reasonably good at every level. Level 1's a little bit bleak, but I do think the Longstrider spell is a good buff, especially on a melee character who maybe needs to be able to move around the battlefield quickly. There's a few decent level 2 buffs. Dragon's Breath is a good buff for your familiar, and it can be a good buff on a party member as well. Shadowblade can be a useful buff. I think some people overrate it because I think it's important to note that a Shadowblade is often not replacing a non-magical weapon. It's often replacing a +1, +2, or even a +3 weapon. And when it does that, of course, it's not going to hit as often. So that increased damage ends up looking a little bit worse once you take into account the increased number of misses. But I do think Shadowblade is a decent buff and a decent spell. And then, of course, if you don't have a magical weapon, just the magic weapon spell can be a good buff as well. And they're both just a bonus action to cast. Level 3 has a couple really good buffs. The first one is Fly, because if you're fighting flying creatures, party members who can fly, especially if they're melee characters, are really going to appreciate it. The other one is Haste. Haste is going to give your big striker 1 extra strike every round. It's going to increase their defense as well, increase their movement speed as well. So there's a number of nice little increases that you provide. Now you are using your concentration for both these spells. So if you do them, then that's all you're doing with your concentration. And again, they're not dramatically powerful, but Fly can be essential as a buff in certain combats. As we get into our level 4 spells, we start getting some very powerful buffs. Improved invisibility is a huge buff, especially somebody who's really going to be able to take advantage of critical hits. Throwing an improved invisibility on something like a paladin, for example, can be massive because then they can apply smites to those critical hits that they're getting more often because they're attacking with advantage. It also is a good defensive buff because then they are attacked with disadvantage, which means they're going to take much less damage. Of course, if somebody's really close to going down, the best buff of all, Polymorph. And Polymorph, 4th level spell, turn them into a giant ape. They get 100 plus hit points, 2 attacks a round for decent damage. It is a solid buff. And of course, the best buff in the game is Foresight at level 9. Not necessarily my first choice for 9th level spells, but it's not a bad choice. Foresight is a very dramatically good buff. Still worth a 9th level slot. Not the most powerful 9th level spell, but it's up there. So next, let's talk about debuffing enemies. So debuffing enemies is just simply making enemies mechanically worse. We have lots of good options here. I tend to like the ones, and I'm well known for this, I tend to like the ones that target multiple targets. Because if you target a single target and they make their save, usually nothing happens. And then you've just wasted a spell, wasted your action, and you've achieved nothing. And I just don't like to be in that situation where I'm making that kind of gamble. And usually those kind of spells have a dramatic effect if they work. So it's kind of an all or nothing scenario. Again, I just want to nudge things. I want to improve the mechanical advantage to my party just enough so that they can make sure to win. So that's why I like the mass debuffs. The ones that make large numbers of enemies a little bit worse. Things like the slow spell are ones to think about here, especially if their enemies and allies are all mixed in together, so you can't necessarily play something like a hypnotic pattern. But if you can get the enemies all together without any friendly fire, hypnotic pattern is, of course, just amazing. Even at level 1, things like a sleep spell is going to be amazing in combat. Ideally, what you want to do with this is you want to make either the enemies mechanically weaker, or you take some of them out of the fight entirely while you clean up one half of them and then you take on the other half of them. So you're essentially halving the amount of damage they're doing to you every round. In regards to subclasses, a couple to think about are the Diviner. Again, if you roll Portent and you rolled a very poor roll or a very low roll, then that is a good roll to apply to an enemy saving throw. So then suddenly those single target big debuffs might be a consideration. Or even if you're doing a mass debuff and just apply it to one enemy, that is really important. The other subclass that kind of stands out in this regard for me is the Enchanter. Because Hypnotic Gaze is such a good lockdown ability, we can take one enemy basically out of the fight. And if it's the really tough enemy, then we're just cleaning up all the fodder. And then we can get ourselves in position, and when that Hypnotic Gaze is lifted, it's over. Then we get into battlefield control. Wizards are the best at battlefield control. Druids can be reasonably good in this area as well. Clerics and bards aren't very good at this. But wizards, again, best in the game. Because of spells like Web, Wall of Force, Fog Cloud, Grease. These all control the battlefield, and often they even don't provide a saving throw to the enemy. And if it doesn't provide a saving throw to the enemy, then it's a sure thing. And a sure thing is what I will always choose when it's available. So to give you an example, you fight a dragon. Dragon has a bunch of thralls, let's say a bunch of kobolds that are going to swarm you. So you cast Wall of Force around the dragon, and then you can just focus on the kobolds, and you don't have to worry about dragon breath coming at you. You don't have to worry about the dragon popping in and out with claws and bites. Instead, you don't have to worry about all those legendary actions. That dragon is completely taken out of the fight. You're just killing kobolds. Once all the kobolds are gone, then you remove the Wall of Force. You are already in a position to attack that dragon. You've probably got party members right there with ready actions. and then that dragon is in a lot of trouble. And there's no little kobolds to help him out anymore. So that's how you use a battlefield control to win a fight. Usually, battlefield control is about divide and conquer. Now, less dramatically at lower levels, sometimes it's just about, when you have groups of enemies, slowing some of them down. Because if you slow some of them down, like you might do with a grease spell, or maybe even with a darkness spell or a sleet storm spell, then you can again have waves of enemies coming at you instead of all of them at once. And that is a huge tactical advantage to your side because they're going to inflict so much less damage. And one group goes down while the next group comes in, and so on and so on, and it really becomes so much easier. And the final aspect of control is healing. Now, wizards don't really have healing spells. We don't have Cure the Wounds, we don't have Healing Word, but I think it is important to remember that spells like Lehman's Tiny Hut and Rope Trick are rest enablers. So when a long or short rest might normally be difficult to take, that Rope Trick or Lehman's Tiny Hut can make it a lot more likely that we're able to take those rests. And rests are really the best way to get hit points back in the game. And we shouldn't forget that a party member might be close to going down. Well, Claire could cast Cure Wounds and heal a D8 plus the Wisdom bonus. We could cast a Polymorph and give them 100 plus hit points. So at the right levels, spells like Polymorph can be more effective than a regular heal spell. Of course, there's no healing at all that's better than not taking damage in the first place. And that's where spells like Counterspell really come into play. So that enemy wizard is going to cast a fireball on your party. Well, they could cast a fireball and then you have to heal everybody, or you can Counterspell and then you don't take that damage in the first place. So that's another way that wizards can kind of fill that role. It's kind of a workaround, right? You're not actually healing hit points, but it doesn't matter. What matters is the end effect. And the end effect is you haven't lost the hit points. So the next combat role I want to talk about is the striker. I've always referred to them as a glass cannon. The idea that they're brittle but powerful. Now there tend to be two kinds of glass cannons. There's ones that focus on single targets and ones that focus on multiple targets. The multiple target one, wizards do great, and that's with the evoker. If you want to fill that role, play an evoker. Then you're going to get your spells like Thunder Wave and Shatter and Fireball. Throw them out all the time. Hit waves of enemies for reasonable amounts of damage. And although your damage to each target might be less, if you're hitting multiple targets, then you need to add those numbers together to determine how much damage you actually inflicted. And that number can be pretty massive, actually. Now, it's important to remember any wizard can do area of effect spells. I'm often going to take Fireball with my wizard regardless of my spell school. But I'm not going to be as good at it as a straight evoker just because you have to worry about friendly fire. And because you're worrying about friendly fire, often you end up positioning that Fireball in a way that it hits less enemies than it would if you could put it anywhere. Sometimes a lot less enemies. And that's why the evoker is going to be inflicting so much more damage. Never mind the fact that they can do things like overchannel eventually. But even before that, right from sculpt spells, an evoker is going to be doing more damage with area of effect. Now when it comes to single target strikers, we're not very good at that. The spells that we have tend not to be super good at doing damage to a single target. I mean, at first level, Magic Missile's okay, but if you think about what a Barbarian can do with a great sword, it's not that great, and especially considering it's using a spell slot, it's really not that great. Now, I will say that an Evoker, once you get to level 10, you can actually use Magic Missile fairly effectively if we're playing by the rules as written and by the rulings of Jeremy Crawford, because he said that if you cast a Magic Missile at a single target, then you only make one damage roll. So you're rolling 1d4, and then you multiply it by 3. I don't think that's the way most people play. I don't play that way at my table. At my table, if you're firing a Magic Missile, you throw 3d4. I guess that's the way we've always done it, and I didn't see the point in changing. But if you play by the way Jeremy Crawford says, then when we are doing Empowered Evocation with our 10th level Evoker ability, then we're rolling that d4 plus 1 plus our intelligence bonus, and then multiplying that by 3. which makes Magic Missile do a lot of damage. Essentially, a first level Magic Missile is going to do 15 extra points of damage. And of course, Magic Missile does scale. It doesn't scale great, but when you're adding your intelligence bonus to every additional missile, suddenly it does scale reasonably well. So we can use that as a tool to do single target damage. And remember, no to hit roll and force damage, which is very seldomly resisted. So I guess the takeaway here, you want to play a glass cannon, whether it's area of effect or even single target, and you want to be a wizard, then Evoker is your choice. That brings us to our final combat role, the Big Stupid Fighter. This is often referred to as the tank, but the Big Stupid Fighter is, generally speaking, a big, high constitution, high hit point, lots of armor character that's going to go in front of the enemies, make itself a target, and take those hits so that the weaker members of the party don't have to worry about it. So wizards should be just terrible at this role, but actually wizards are not bad at this role at all. I'd say we're better at this role than we are at the glass cannon role. Now there are some decisions in the build we have to make. I'm not going to take any wizard and put them in front of the enemies in melee and see what happens. That's not going to go well for us. But if we're playing a Blade Singer is actually a pretty good Big Stupid Fighter, because the Blade Singer is going to go into melee, and even at level 2, we're going to have probably a 16 dexterity, we're probably going to have mage armor, and then we're probably going to be using our blade song. So those three things alone give us an armor class of 19. 19 is going to be as good as anybody in the party, and better than almost anybody. Basically, if you're playing like a fighter type or a paladin type, and you've taken the defensive combat style, and you're using a shield, and you're using scale mail or chainmail, then you would have an equivalent armor class to the Blade Singer, and that's it. And the Blade Singer, of course, then can cast a shield spell, which can get that 19 up to 24. So we can get into armor classes that are pretty insane. And as we level up, we can use spells to increase our defense even more so. So when we get into things like Mirror Image, or we might even concentrate on something like a Blur spell, so every attack against us now has disadvantage. So suddenly you're trying to hit an armor class of 19 with disadvantage. Not going to happen very often. Now I can see potentially doing this as well, maybe with an Abjurer, or maybe with a War Mage, and I would be looking very closely at race then. I mentioned this in my subclass video that a Githyanki gets medium armor proficiency right off the bat, so they can put on half plate. Now they can't use a shield, but they could use a shield spell, of course, to improve their armor class from that half plate. And then if there's something like an Abjurer on top of that, then they have their Arcane Ward to buff up the hit points. So then they have a reasonable armor class and the reasonable hit points. Never mind other ways of alleviating damage. Things like Absorb Elements, which works well with the melee build, or things like Counterspell as well. And then if you mix that with something like a Great Sword and Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade, you can actually do a decent amount of damage as well. You're not going to be single target striker kind of damage. You make a sword in build, you're going to do a lot more damage. But still, if we're using our attack cantrips along with a decent weapon in melee and the various advantages we get from being a wizard, then we can at least do a reasonable amount of damage, enough to contribute. And because we're a wizard, we're probably going to be casting other spells as well, not just self-buffs. So we would be going into combat, and then we might be maintaining a hypnotic pattern while we're hacking away at an enemy. And that's going to make us a target, because we're concentrating on that hypnotic pattern, because we're the wizard. They are going to want to focus attacks on us. And because we have layered defenses, it is going to be hard for them to hit us. And so we end up fulfilling the role that the Big Stupid Fighter is supposed to do. I'm also going to mention the Hobgoblin here. The Hobgoblin does not get medium armor proficiency, but they do get light armor proficiency. So if they were to take the moderately armored feat, which they would now qualify for, then they could use half plate and a shield. So that could be quite good too. Now, wizards are pretty feat hungry and pretty ability score hungry as well, so it's not like being able to take moderately armored is free. It's going to hurt, but we can do it. Now it's important to remember that we aren't necessarily confined to one role. This isn't like previous editions where we're ultra specialized. If we are playing an Abjurer that's a Githyanki up on the front lines, We might have a great armor class and be drawing enemy attacks, but we still might be doing debuffing enemies. We still might be controlling the battlefield. We're still probably casting polymorph spells. And out of combat, we might also be the utility caster and the knowledge guy. But because we're a Githyanki with strength and a great sword, we might also be filling the strongman role and our find familiar for scouting. So we can fill a lot of different roles at once. Don't feel like you have to pick a role. But what you do want to do, if you want to be tactically strong, you should look at what all the players are going to play and what kind of style they're going to play. Then we're going to know what roles they're going to fill. Are there gaps? If there are gaps, then that might affect our character choices so that we can fill those gaps. So are there party roles that you think a wizard can fill that maybe I didn't mention? Maybe I've missed some party roles. You can tell me in the comments down below. But for me, in the meantime, I'm going to sit back and relax, and I'm going to have some fun. Because D&D is for everyone, and I will see everyone next week right here for Races.